Hey everyone, this is Zach with 8020 Media, here today with a video on signs and symptoms of a faulty window regulator or motor. The window regulator and motor on vehicles are very simple, straightforward components, and a lot of the times the signs and symptoms of failures and issues can be straightforward as well. So the window regulator is simply the mechanical assembly responsible for actually physically moving your vehicle's window up and down, whereas the window motor is an electric motor that simply provides power and actually moves the regulator, which in turn that regulator moves the window up and down. So with that said, a few of the most common signs and symptoms of a faulty window motor or regulator include the window being stuck up or down, or it may even get stuck in the middle, the window moving too quickly or too slowly, the window motor making funky sounds like whining, whirring, or grinding noises, the window motor is making clicking sounds but the window still isn't moving, and then lastly, the window being off center or out of place. So if you notice the window is maybe moved an inch or two in a certain direction or not going completely up or completely down, these can all be common signs and symptoms of a faulty window motor or regulator. Ultimately, if you're having issues with your vehicle's windows, most often it boils down to an issue with either the regulator or the motor. There are a couple other things that can cause problems with your windows, like a fuse or an electric issue with the circuits going from your window switch or window button to the window motor itself. But again, a vast majority of the time, if you're running into issues with your windows, it often boils down to the window regulator or motor. So really the next most important question is determining whether you actually have an issue with the window regulator or the window motor. So with that said, that'll be a bulk of our focus in the remainder of this video, is discussing window motor versus regulator failure and how to really determine which issue you're having with your vehicle's window. Before diving into this, I do want to make one final note about window regulators and motors. Some vehicles actually just use an assembly that includes both the window regulator and window motor. So if your vehicle uses an assembly, a lot of the times it won't even matter diagnosing this further and determining what the exact issue is, since if you go ahead and replace that assembly, that will knock out both the window motor and regulator. So if you have an assembly, it will be slightly more expensive to replace, but again, eliminates the need for further diagnostics. However, if you do have the ability to buy the components individually for your vehicle, then it can certainly be helpful to track down the exact issue and be able to replace the correct component rather than replacing both of them if you don't need to. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump in and discuss a few of the best ways to determine whether you have an issue with the regulator or the motor itself. Number one is using the specific symptoms of your window issues to help determine the root cause. When it comes to the window regulator, when they fail, a lot of the times you'll be able to actually move the window up and down with your hand without really much or any resistance at all. And a lot of the times when the regulator actually fails, it will allow the window to drop down completely into the door, at which point without removing the door panel, you probably won't even be able to grab down and reach the window and pull it up by hand. Another common symptom when you have regulator failure is that you can hear the window motor actually making clicking sounds and trying to move the regulator. However, if the regulator has failed, the motor will keep clicking and keep running and trying to move the window, but the regulator simply will not move and is jammed or completely failed and stuck in the down position. With the window motor, a lot of the times when your window motor fails, it will be with the window in the up position or maybe even midway if you were in the process of moving the window up or down. It will fail in the middle or up top oftentimes and won't just automatically drop down into the door. And if you do try to move that window by hand, a lot of the times it will feel like it's stuck or securely sitting in its current position. When it comes to sounds with window motor issues, again, a clicking sound is a healthy sound, a normal sound for a window motor. So if you're hearing a light clicking, it's probably not the motor. However, if you're hearing any kind of whirring, grinding, whining, or other odd kind of bad sounds, then a lot of the times that can point to an issue with the window motor and something failing within the motor electrically. So those specific symptoms can really help narrow it down depending on what your failure is. However, if your symptoms aren't giving you much to go off of here, then it will require a little further diagnostics and testing to determine the root cause of the window problems. So moving on to step two, check and test the window motor. So there are a couple different ways to do this. You can use a simple test light that will measure electricity electricity and current to a certain component, and it will simply light up the light at the top of the little test light. So this is a great tool. They're generally about $10 to $20 to pick up, and you can start all the way up at the window switch and work your way down the circuit back to the window motor to ensure everything is receiving proper voltage and current to actually operate the motor. Another option is connecting a battery or jumpers to the window motor to see if it's actually getting power. Once you know it's getting power, if the window motor still isn't running, then that can help point you in the right direction and that you probably have an issue with the window motor itself rather than the regulator. And then lastly, you can also use a multimeter to test the voltage at the window motor, again, to ensure that you are getting electrical current to that window motor. And if things still aren't working, then that can help pinpoint that the motor is the issue. If it's getting proper power and you're hearing a clicking sound indicating the motor is working or at least trying to work, then a lot of the times that will indicate that you have an issue with the window regulator. Moving on to our third way to distinguish whether you have an issue with the motor or the regulator is a simple visual inspection. So once you make it to the point of actually removing the door panel from the interior of the vehicle, a lot of the time simply inspecting the regulator and motor can help point you in the right direction. When you have an issue with the window regulator, a lot of the times you'll notice that the cords are tangled or things look gunked up. And again, with the motor, you can check to make sure everything is properly connected, that the grounding is there, and that you actually have power to the motor. So a quick visual inspection can certainly help pinpoint the exact issue you're having with your vehicle's window. Now, when it comes to replacing your window motor or regulator, again, as I mentioned earlier in the video, some vehicles actually just have a window assembly where you have both the motor and the regulator. If this is the case, you can just go ahead and replace that as a whole, and that will knock out your issue, whether it's the motor or the regulator, doesn't really matter at that point. Another thing to point out is even if the parts are individual, if you're doing this on an older vehicle, it may still make sense to go ahead and do both the regulator and the motor. Sometimes one of the parts failing can put more stress on the other component and lead to another failure there. So if you're in the area, a lot of the times it doesn't hurt to just go ahead and knock out both the motor and regulator. And that's especially true because these are both generally pretty inexpensive parts. For both the window regulator and motor, generally they run about $40 to $100 each, or if you have an assembly that includes both the motor and the regulator, a lot of the times that will run in the ballpark of about $75 to $200, so relatively inexpensive to replace both of these. On my BMW, I replaced the window regulator, and even on that car, the window regulator was only about $50, and I think the motor was about the same $50 cost. So even on some kind of higher end luxury vehicles, oftentimes these are still cheaper components, and they're very easy to fix and replace. A novice DIYer should be able to knock out this job in the driveway or garage in a quick 1 or 2 hours just with a simple YouTube video. Look up some videos for replacing the regulator and or motor on your specific vehicle. Now, if you're going to a repair shop for this job, an experienced mechanic should be able to knock out a window motor and regulator, or either one of the two, in about 15 to 45 minutes. So you really shouldn't be paying more than about 1 hour labor, maybe 1.5 hours labor. Some shops do kind of have a labor minimum, but ultimately relatively inexpensive and simple repair if you decide to go ahead and DIY this job. Anyway, guys, that wraps up our video for today. If you appreciated the content, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for more. Thanks, everyone.